CGTN, China Global Television Network.
From hosting some of the world's fastest growing economies to struggling through downturns in its largest economies, 2019 goes down as quite the eventful year for markets in Africa. The year has seen the continent rally to set up groundbreaking trade paths and making key strides to achieve a borderless Africa. And in the midst of uncertainty posed by mounting global protectionism, the continent's relations with its trading counterpart, China, have on the contrary seen renewed strategic partnerships. In between the news headlines of stories that define the world, humanity has also played witness to remarkable achievements by Africans. So what economic developments shaped Africa in 2019? And what did the year bear for relations between China and Africa? And what were those moments that thrust Africa onto the global stage? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And to help us analyze the year that has been for Africa on the economic front, as well as for China and Africa relations, I'm joined by our distinguished panel of experts. Professor John Gong is a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. With me in studio is Professor Pt.2, president of the Africa Policy Institute. Thank you both for your time as we look back on the economic performance of Africa in 2019. Professor Kagwanja, let me start off with you because we want to look at the continent's overall growth projection. In 2019, it was forecast to grow at 4%, while global growth was slightly slower at 3.2%. Let's get your impression first of Africa's performance in 2019.
Africa performed very well in 2019 in terms of its growth, and it sustained its growth, which started way back in 2000. At an average of 5%, but up and down 4%. But Africa experienced a good growth. Also, in terms of investment environment, most of the reports are indicating that the investment environment on the continent has increased. You'll also notice that the stability of the environment within which business is taking place, in terms of security, we have seen enhancement in many of the countries. The conflicts of the 1990s and early 2000 have calmed down a little bit. There have been major interventions, which I'm hoping we are going to talk about. But essentially, 2019 was a good year for Africa in terms of the growth in business. Again, you can trace it back to the number of activities that have been taking place internationally, or events to boost Africa's economic growth, from TICAD at the middle of the year, G20, and earlier on we had the FOCAC summit in the 2018, which started being implemented in 2019 through to 2020. So basically, even international environment has also been favorable to the continent.
Right. International environment has been favorable, and the investment environment on the continent increased. Professor John Gong, China is Africa's single largest trading partner and a leading investor. In terms of 2019, where did we see China and other investors putting their money on the continent?
Well, there's an overall background here that China sees Africa as more and more important in the context of China's international relationship with the rest of the world, especially in areas of trade and investment. Overall trade between China and Africa as a whole is still moderate compared with China's leading trading partners, including European Union, ASEAN countries, United States. But it's growing. But its market is growing very fast, and especially when it comes to China's investments in Africa. Now, I also want to mention one thing. Recently, there's a report coming out of the World Economic Forum looking at countries' economic growth overall. There are several African countries that are high up on that list, way over 6-7% growth on an annual basis. These are some of the West African countries. In Central Africa, Rwanda is doing very well. Ethiopia is also doing very well, and East African countries. So some of these countries are actually one of the top performers. On a global basis. So I think Africa overall is doing quite well, and as investment keeps pouring into Africa, especially from China, and also including from countries in the European Union, from Japan as well, I think there's a great hope for Africa.
Let's look at those top performers, Professor Kagwanja, because Sub-Saharan Africa's growth focus was led by Ethiopia, Rwanda, countries like Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, Benin, Uganda, Burkina Faso. Those were some of Africa's top performers in 2019. Looking at these countries, though, particularly Rwanda, what is fueling some of the growth, and which sectors are fueling economic growth? Are they traditional sectors, or are they new investments?
I think it's mixed. Mixed in the sense that, first and foremost, if you look at Africa's growth, the major development in this country is the return of stability, meaning the investment environment has been favorable, and therefore they have consistently been able to attract foreign investments. Two is the stability of the governments themselves after election. If you look at Rwanda, politically it is very stable. Ethiopia went through a kind of an uncertainty at the beginning of 2018. After April, Ethiopia has stabilized. And therefore, you begin to see that these countries are basically trying to move to the industrial phase. Most of them are agrarian countries. Others are counting on mineral resources. You talked about Burkina Faso, you talked about Niger and others. Kenya, for example, is an agrarian economy. This year alone, Kenya started exporting petroleum. It sent its first consignment of barrels of petroleum to the world market, which is groundbreaking. Uganda is at the toe. It's also going to get its petroleum into the market. So we are seeing countries that are gradually, slowly but gradually moving to the industrial level, countries that were previously agrarian and are becoming mineral-based economies together with agriculture. But also, much of Africa's economy has been driven by the IT technology. And the mobile phone penetration on the country, in Africa, is very, very high. There is a lot of exchange of resources through mobile money transfers. And therefore, the economies are beginning to become more balanced, moving from the traditional agrarian or agricultural based to more manufacturing within the agricultural sector, and coupled with now the minerals and the IT technology.
Professor Gong, two things that I want to get from you here. First, are we seeing a lot of value addition of African products now getting onto the international market, or what exactly is China trading with Africa on? And secondly, the countries that we have mentioned as some of the fastest growing, and you mentioned Ethiopia, you mentioned Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana. Those are some of the fastest growing economies in Africa, but also the fastest growing in the world. What's making these economies in Africa so globally competitive?
Well, we've been talking about industrialization. As I see it, industrialization at this stage for Africa, I would say it's mostly in these light industries. For example, in garment industry, in shoemaking industry, in food processing, for example, beverages. These are light industries that are making use of the resources in Africa for agricultural resources, human labor resources, other cotton, for example, some raw materials. You have to add value to these raw materials before you ship them out. I mean, that's light industrialization is all about. And I think in that aspect, countries like Ethiopia, you mentioned, and also I mentioned, Rwanda, they're actually doing very well. I mean, this really requires investment from manufacturing countries, for example, from China. And also you need a infrastructure, especially infrastructure for generating electricity, the port facility, the roads to the port, all these things, logistics, all these things are important. And that's where, China's Belt and Road Initiative comes in, to help these countries to invest in these infrastructure. Another thing I want to mention is that China is now becoming a very large importing country. As you know, we have a huge trade surplus with Africa, and we try to import more things out of Africa. And I think in this aspect, some of our e-commerce companies are doing makes a great deal of a difference for some certain countries. For example, Alibaba has set up a sort of a distribution hub in Rwanda. They're trying to bring Rwanda coffee into the Chinese market. You think about this, Rwanda coffee doesn't have a brand name at all around the world, including in China. Now, because of the e-platform, it has a brand effect now. Rwanda coffee is actually, I was told, selling very well here in China. It's examples like these, with the help of the modern digital economic platforms, with the infrastructure built out, with investments to build up these light industries, and with the very bountiful resources, raw material resources, agricultural resources in these African countries. I see a great hope of cooperation between an African side and at least from China's side.
Professor Gong, you have talked about the Belt and Road Initiative as being one of the major investment that China is having on the continent. What do you see as the impact, though, that the Belt and Road Initiative will have for trade between China and Africa?
Well, infrastructure is extremely important, and we here in China, we learned this lesson very well. I mean, look at the China's whole reform and open door policy dating back to the late 1980s, 1990s. This country, here in China, we put tons and tons of money into building infrastructures by, issuing bonds, by leveraging of the loans from the World Bank. We have built roads, we have built electricity generation plants, ports facilities, airports, railroads. All these infrastructures are very critical to contribute to China's success in the manufacturing sector. Today, we call China the world's manufacturing factory, right? And this is indispensable with the build of this infrastructure. And I think Chinese companies have, over the years, have accumulated great experience and also have developed, great equipment to build these mega projects. And I think, and also build these things quite cost effectively. Also, that's very important, I want to point out. So I think, it's against that backdrop that Chinese companies are going to Africa, trying to build more infrastructures. These are critical infrastructures. At the very least, you need the electricity grid, for example. You need an electricity generation plant. You need a little bit of a port facility. These are the things, at least, very important for building a light industry for exports purpose, to ship the goods out of the country. These are the very basic stuff that we have to do.
Right. Professor, let's talk about the situation that has been, the debates that has been ongoing on the continent this year. The whole question of debt that has characterized many debates across the world regarding China's financing and China's trading with the continent. What's that debate about?
The debate is driven largely, if you wish, by xenophobia. China is a new partner for Africa, and that is basically bringing a lot of uncertainties to Africa's traditional partners. And at this age and time, the fourth industrial revolution, driven by social media, we've seen a lot of propaganda that is completely unfounded about China colonizing Africa, China taking over Africa, China being Africa's next master, China trapping Africa in debt. But the truth of the matter is that this is pure propaganda, but it is cutting through. And I think there is much effort need to be taken by China and its partners to counter this. But to do so, they must bring facts on the table. For example, China's debt for the entire of the African continent, the 55 countries, is only 20%. The other 80% is owed to other countries. 32%, I guess, to Western multilateral donors, about about 30 or so percent to individual donors, and even private borrowing, like Kenya is now on its third Eurobond, a bond from European lenders to Kenya. Something else that one needs to look at is the percentage, the kind of money that's coming from China is coming directly for investment. Take, for example, the railway between Mombasa and Nairobi, and now has reached Naivasha, is on its way to Kisumu. You can account for every shilling there. And this is a multi-generational investment. It is not a one-off investment. Go to America and look at the time of Roosevelt, the New Deal, as it's called in America. Look at the amount of money that America used to build infrastructure, to build its cities, to build investments in order to create jobs for its future generations. And that was the foundation on which America built to become a superpower. Why is it that when Africa is doing the same, it is called a trap? How can you be trapped in development? Is it not ridiculous that development is trapping you? Africa needs resources from Europe, from America, from China, from Southeast Asia, from anywhere, from Russia, in order to build infrastructure, to move the energy level so that you can industrialize faster, and to be able to feed your population in terms of food security.
Let me get Professor Gong's thoughts on this. What is your assessment, Professor Gong, of Africa's debt situation?
Well, I think the whole idea of the debt trap is premised upon a conspiracy theory. In other words, it's not just lending money. It's also lending money to the extent that you go broke and we take control. If people really believe in this kind of a theory, I think, it just blow my mind away. I don't think, Chinese companies going to Africa with this grand design in mind. I mean, this is total crazy in my opinion. I mean, I have to admit that there are examples that some countries that have taken on too much debt, that's in hindsight, but this is unfortunate, and we have to be very careful. So moving forward, I think, we have to be very careful, both the African side as well as the Chinese government side, especially, these two banks that have been writing these loans, China Export-Import Bank and China Development Bank, they have to take extra caution when it comes to making loans to some African countries that have already taken a lot of debt, whose debt level is pretty high already. So, so we have to exercise this level of caution. But this is totally different from setting up a trap. So I admit that some African countries have quite a high level of debt, and be very careful about that. But on the other hand, I totally refute the theory that we go in trying to set up things and try to take control. This is totally unfounded.
Right, gentlemen, we'll take a short break now, but do stay tuned. The conversation on 2019 and looking into 2020 continues in a moment. Stay with us.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, 2019 has also been the year where Africans' pursuit for excellence has known no limits. Africans have in the year proudly brought home the Teacher of the Year Award, the coveted Miss Universe crown, as well as the Nobel Peace Prize. This and many other events have altogether fronted Africa as a powerhouse in diverse arena. Before our panelists break down the significance of these big occasions, let's first take a trip down memory lane at some of these moments that moved the continent and the world.
Pt.2. for Miss Universe, South Africa.
Well, my panel of experts is still on standby. Professor John Gong in Beijing. I'm also now joined by Dr. David Monyai in Johannesburg. He's the Director for Africa for China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. And with me in Nairobi is Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute. Dr. Monyai, thank you for joining us on the program. Africa did show its prowess on the global stage. Let's start off with South Africa's under Rugby World Cup, as well as South Africa's Zozubini Tunzi winning the Miss Universe 2019. What did this do, though, to the national spirit in South Africa, a country that is still hit by racial tensions?
Indeed. This story tells a much larger story in which South Africans are as good as any other people in the world. I think what this proves to the world is that given opportunities, given resources, infrastructure required to excel, I think the continent, African people would perform at their very best, and they'll compete with the best in the world. I think 2019 has demonstrated that we can win any arena anywhere in the world.
Professor Kagwanja, I do want to come back to Kenya's situation because Peter Tabichi was awarded the Global Teacher of the Year prize. Eliud Kipchoge broke the sub 2-hour marathon barrier. I mean, what do moments like this, though, mean for us, Africa, in terms of policy and charting the way forward?
You know, in the 1990s and early 2000, Africa was was depicted as a very hopeless continent that was going nowhere. It was basically a dark continent. But with the developments that we have spoken about before and the kind of achievements that Africans are making in all quarters, it is giving a sense of hope. And a hopeful continent is not just hopeful in terms of economic progress that we have made, but in terms of the individual talents that we are beginning to tap into. Eliud Kipchoge, for example, breaking the record by doing the athlete by less than 2 minutes was a huge boost to Kenya's and Africa's spirits. The same case with the rugby in South Africa and what we have seen in terms of performance in specific sectors like education, where a Kenyan teacher basically scoops the world prize for the best teacher, and that is very encouraging. It is basically building to the entire sense of hope that the continent finds itself in, and that is now translating into more energy, more investment, and more activity in terms of economic development.
Did we see, though, in 2019 a more enhanced Africa image on the global stage?
Yes, we did. We saw that Africa was a subject of discussion globally, from the Russia's Africa Summit to the TICAD Summit, which is the Tokyo International Conference on Africa's Development, to the G20, down to this month, the CARICOM, the Africa, Pacific and Caribbean Country Conference in Nairobi. Our capital cities, both Johannesburg, Nairobi, Abuja, and others, were hosting major conferences. Basically, Africa is at the new frontier of growth globally.
Right. Dr. Monyai, I want to get your thoughts on that. Did you get a sense that Africa's image was enhanced on the global stage in 2019?
It is, and increasingly so. I think this is a picture of the future as well. By 2050, we're going to be 2.4 billion people. We have the largest number of youth. It's a very young continent, and we have 60% of the global arable land. And given resources in terms of infrastructure, the agricultural sector, it's going to really feed the whole world if we do work hard and keep on doing the best that we are currently doing. With volumes in terms of free trade agreement, I think you're going to see changes going into other sectors. We haven't explored the ocean economy. I think there's more opportunities. We have the largest coastal land that need to be activated and to really put the youth to employment. One of the biggest problem we have is unemployment. So there are a lot of opportunities. Sport, it's an arena that is also coming on board. And if we keep on working with other countries, my brother Pt.2 just mentioned the agreements that we are entering with Russia, China, Japan, United States, and the European Union. I think we need to use those agreements to put our people at work, as well as to be in the forefront of technological development. The fourth industrial revolution should be the focus of the continent as we enter the 2010, 2020, ensure that we are not left behind, and the lessons of the past, that peace and security are key to all these achievements that we're making.
Right. Professor Gong, I want to get your comments as we wind up the program. Your thoughts on the key moments for China in Africa in 2019. What do you think those were?
Well, I think China is going to continue to invest in Africa. We're going to continue to trade with Africa. I think what Africa has done greatly in 2019. One event I want to highlight is the establishment of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. This is a huge trade agreement encompassing almost every country. Only one country hadn't signed, I think. And this is going to create a unified market, on the same scale as, for example, the European Union. And also here in Asia, we're trying to reach an RCEP agreement. This is going to reduce tariffs, going to increase intercontinental trade, and as the trade goes on, there will be more development opportunities, wealth will be created. I think this is probably the most important economic event in Africa in 2019. And China very much wants to be part of that. China is currently undergoing negotiation between China and the African Continent Free Trade Area. And I think this is going to contribute immensely to Africa's development in the future.
Gentlemen, we'll leave it there for the moment. And that's it for this edition of Talk Africa. It's a wrap from us for this week and the year 2019. As always, a warm thank you to our panel for sharing their thoughts and expertise. John Gong is a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Dr. David Monyai in Johannesburg, the co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Johannesburg. And with me in studio, Professor Pt.2, president of the Africa Policy Institute. You can reach us on social media through our Facebook and Twitter handles showing on your screen right now. And do also visit our YouTube playlist and the CGTN Africa website to catch this and past episodes of Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here on Talk Africa, it's goodbye and a Happy New Year.